Hello, my name is Rachel and I'm the sewing pattern designer here at Cwtch Patterns. Now today I'm going to show you every step of how to make a flat cap for your memory bear. So here it is first of all, modelled on my Charlie bear, and here it is in a slightly darker denim on my Betsy bear. And I'm going to show you every single step of how to sew this pattern from putting the interfacing on your fabric all the way through to that final seam. If you haven't already bought the pattern, then the links to buy are below. And I really hope you find this video useful. Thank you for watching. Once you've received your memory bear flat cap pattern, the first stage is to cut out around the edge of each of the sewing pattern pieces. The seam allowance is included, so there's no need to add that onto your pattern pieces. The next stage is to stick them, if you want to keep them for a while, stick them onto a cardboard like a pizza box. You want a cardboard that's thin enough to be able to cut around the curves easily, but is tough enough that it's not going to break immediately. The next stage is to draw around your pattern pieces onto your interfacing. So all of the pieces are cut one, so you can see the back here, cut one, front, cut one, except for the brim, which is cut two, so make sure you draw around the hat brim twice. When you draw around your pattern pieces, make sure that all the marks, like the asterisks, these lines either side of the gap for the ear, the centre point marking, etc., are all transferred onto your interfacing, and then make sure that they are drawn so that they're into where the pattern piece is as well. So this line, I'll be cutting this out in a bit, so I want to make sure that my asterisks and my lines are all transferred through so that I don't lose my markings. With all your pattern pieces drawn out onto your interfacing, next cut them out. I wouldn't cut directly on the line because these are going to be ironed onto your fabric and then you'll need to cut them out again. So you may as well just cut them out now with a bit of a margin and then do the neat cut once they're on the fabric. So cut the pattern pieces out of the interfacing, leave a little margin around the outside so there's no need to be neat, and then iron it onto the reverse side of the fabric that you're going to use for your bear's cap. Once you've ironed all of the interfacing onto your fabric, just cut it out. This time though, do cut it out neatly on the line. With all of your hat pieces now interfaced and cut out, the next stage is to cut out the strip of fabric that will be the band for your bear's hat. So the measurements are in the pattern, just cut it out, a nice simple rectangle, and put it to one side for later. Now that we've prepared all of the fabric pieces, we're going to start sewing them together. So you'll notice that the pieces are labelled up as seam 1, seam 2, seam 3, etc. The pattern's laid out like that too, to make it nice and easy for you. So we'll put our two pieces of brim together, right sides of fabric facing each other, and let's pin them together through the central point. And then we'll pop another pin up here in the corner, and another on this corner. There we are, and then we'll take it across to the sewing machine. Before I start to sew, I just want to show you my machine setup. So I have got it on a small stitch length. I have got a yellow thread that will work as my top stitch because it gives a nice contrast with the dark denim I'm using, and I am using a red thread for my bobbin thread so that I can just show you the lines that I've stitched. Normally I'd have picked 2 yellow for the contrast. And then my needle is a heavy duty needle because I'm sewing denim and I'm sewing through multiple layers of fabric, so make sure you've got the right needle for your project. My needle is set up then to be 5mm, or if you were working in imperial, 1/4 inch away from the edge of the presser foot. What I do is I sew with the edge of my presser foot running along the raw edge of my fabric, and then that gives me a really nice, neat and even seam allowance. Let's sew seam 1. So I'm going to sew from the middle of seam 1 round to one end, and then the middle of seam 1 round to the other end, rather than sewing it as one continuous line of stitching, because these little skinny ends here, they can get caught up in your machine or in the threads and make a mess. So I'm going to start from the middle. I'm going to pop my presser foot down, and as I just said, the edge of my presser foot here is against the raw edge of my fabric. I'm just going to pop my needle down into my fabric, and I'm just going to sew along here until I start to get to the curve. Now I'm at the beginning of this curve. What I need to do, I could try to move this piece of fabric using my hands, but that could go wrong. And especially on a tight curve, that is really difficult. So what you want to do instead is just put your needle down into your fabric, lift your presser foot up, turn the fabric a little, pop the presser foot back down, and then keep sewing again until this presser foot stops being lined up with the curve, and then we will just reorientate our fabric again. There we are, sew your needle down, presser foot up, turn the fabric, presser foot down. I'm going to keep going all the way to the pointed corner at the end, and then at the end of this line of stitches I'll do a couple of reverse stitches. That's just to secure the thread so it doesn't come undone, and then I'm going to pop my fabric back and I am going to sew the other end of seam 1. So I'll show you what I mean in a moment. So here's the beginning of my seam 1, and now I'm going to put my fabric back under my presser foot and pop the needle in just before where I started originally in the centre, put my needle down, and I'm going to sew around to the far end of seam 1, and again I'll do a couple of reverse stitches to finish the line of stitches off. My seam 1 is now fully sewn, and what I was trying to explain at the machine is I sewed from the middle round to this end and then the middle round to this end so that my thin ends of my fabric didn't get caught up. Now I'm going to trim around the outside of the seam allowance using my pinking shears. When you do this, be careful not to snip through your line of stitching. By cutting this with the pinking shears, it just allows that fabric to curve more easily when we turn it inside out in a moment. Once you have cut all the way around your seam allowance with your pinking shears, next turn the brim pieces through so the right side of fabric faces outwards, and then just get your kid's paintbrush or other tool with a slim end and just push to make sure that fabric is nicely curved, that it's not puckered or messed up in any way. Then what you want to do is hold it so that the edges of the fabric are definitely nice and neatly together. Maybe pop in a couple of pins just to ensure that it's all lined up, and then I'll do the other couple of pins in a moment. Once you've done that, take it across to your iron, put your iron on a steam setting and just iron round here to hold that curve nice and neatly. Here are my brim pieces and I have pressed them with my iron. Next I'm going to sew a line of top stitching from this end all the way around to this end, and I will do that 5mm or 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of my fabric, and I'm going to use a contrasting thread. Here we are with that line of stitches sewn, and I've chosen a yellow because it looks really nice against the dark of the denim. Now we're going to sew seam 2. Seam 2 runs around this curve here of the brim and this curve here of the rise, and I've put a pin into the centre point of the seam 2 of both. So let's remove the pattern pieces out of the way, and I'm going to lay my brim onto my rise. There we are, so that my pins are lined up. I'm going to turn it a little, get those nicely lined up, and just pin them together. And I'm going to put another pin here. And another pin here. You'll see in the pattern that the end of the brim on seam 2 is not designed to end at the same point as the end of seam 2 of the rise. This is intentional and it will become clear why later. So when you go to your sewing machine, if you start to sew seam 2 from the centre point here, make sure you've got the rise is sitting against the sewing machine and this brim is facing upwards so you can see. And as you sew, then just bring this piece round and your stitching will come off the end of here, and then do a couple of reverse stitches. Then you're going to pop it back under your machine, and again you'll sew from the centre point round to the end, moving the fabric as you go, and the brim here, you'll come off the end of the brim and just do those couple of reverse stitches here on the rise. So at the sewing machine I am going to put my brim and rise under my presser foot and just set that presser foot down so the edge of it is against the raw edge of my fabric, and from my centre point, as I said, pop the needle into the fabric, and I'm going to sew as far as this pin, and then I'm just going to move this fabric round so that it all fits nicely together. Now I'm going to pop my needle down, lift my presser foot, turn the fabric a little, put the foot back down, and at this point I'm just going to move this, hold this fabric with my hands, and it's lined up to about this point here. So I'm just going to gently sew round and then stop again. Pop my needle back down, line things up a little more. There we are, and then a bit more sewing. And then just line it up again because it's moved a little. There we go. Now at this point your needle is going to come off the end of that brim fabric. That's absolutely fine. Just let it come off as you sew. There we are. Let's put the needle down into the fabric, do a couple of reverse stitches, and that's just secured our seam so it doesn't come undone. I'll take my fabric out from under my foot and snip off those loose ends, and then I am going to repeat the process. So from this centre point here round to the end of the brim, off the end of the brim and onto the rise there, just to complete seam 2. Here is my seam 2 fully sewn, and as you can see the stitches come off the end of the brim here, they come off the end of the brim here, and that's absolutely fine. And now just pop these pins out, and I'm just going to just cut the curved piece here and here with my pinking shears. And the other curve. Now we're ready for seam 3. Next we are going to sew seam 3, and that is the curve that goes around here on the hat rise and the curve that goes around here on the hat front. So again, I've put a pin in the centre point of each, and let's put the pattern pieces out the way. So I'm just going to turn this piece around and put these pins together. So I've got my right sides of fabric together. Let's take one pin out, pop this pin through the 2 layers, and then I'm just going to pin all the way around. This time the edges will meet up. So once I've got around here, as I pull these pieces of fabric together, the 2 ends will meet up perfectly here, and the 2 ends will meet up perfectly here as well. Here's my seam 3, and it's pinned from one end all the way to the other. I'm just going to take this across to the sewing machine and sew it up. Seam 3 is fully sewn. Next I am going to just trim the excess fabric away from the seam allowances at both ends, and I'm going to just cut around these curves with my pinking shears. When you do this, just be careful, as usual, don't snip through your line of stitching. We are now sewing seam 4, which is on this part of the hat front and this part of the hat back. It looks complicated, but don't worry, we'll do it one step at a time. First we are going to prepare the gaps for the bear's ears. So you can see they're marked here and here on the hat back, and then very similarly on the hat front piece. So let's get our fabric, and you can see I've put the markings here, here and here and here. So what we'll do to start with is we're just going to put a pin at the beginning and end of each of those 2 gaps of this piece. Oops, 1, 2, 3 and 4. And we will do the same for the ear gaps on the hat front piece. So there and there, not that one because that's the centre point. Another pin there. Oops. And another pin there. You'll see in the pattern that it then says to sew a guide stitch 1 centimetre or 6/8 away from the raw edge of fabric along all 4 of the ear gaps. So if I just grab my hat back again, so here's your back. These are the 2 pins that are either end of the ear gap, and what we're going to do is we're going to sew from here along to here 1 centimetre or 6/8 if you're using imperial away from this raw edge. We're not going all the way along, we're not sewing 2 pieces together, we're purely sewing from the first pin to the second pin that is showing the beginning and end of this first ear gap. Here are the first set of guide stitches sewn on the hat back, so you can see that there's the pin at the beginning of the ear gap, pin at the end of the ear gap, and I've sewn from one to the other, and that is 1 centimetre or 6/8 of an inch away from the raw edge of the fabric. I've not sewn this to anything, I've purely sewn a straight line there and done the same there, and I'm now going to repeat this for the ear gaps on the hat front. And here is the hat front, and again I've sewn those lines of guide stitchings by each of the ear gaps. Next we are going to sew the middle of seam 4, so that's this dashed line here that runs from one ear gap end to the other ear gap end through the centre point. So on my hat back you can see I've put a yellow pin here in the centre and these orangey pins either end of the ear gap. I've done the same on the hat front piece. So these need to be sewn right side to right side. So I'm going to turn the front piece through so the right side of fabric faces outwards, and then I'm just going to lay it down onto my hat back, and I've got these yellow pins in the centre. Let's take one out and pin through, so we're pinning centre point to centre point, and the same with the orange ones. Let's take one out and then pin through the 2 layers, and this one the same. Now we're going to sew that seam, and again we're using this 1 centimetre seam allowance. So I'm just going to pop my foot down, put my needle down into my fabric, and I am a couple of millimetres in front of that ear gap. So I'll do a few reverse stitches. That's taken me up to this pin on the end of the ear gap, and then I'm going to sew forwards to this orange pin for the other ear gap, a couple of reverse stitches to finish. There we are. And here is the middle of seam 4 now it's been sewn. You can see here it's these yellow stitches. When I turn it over you can see, because these are all red, that they're all 1 centimetre away from the raw edge of the fabric. Remember the asterisks at the end of the hat back and the end of the hat rise? This is where they're going to meet up. They don't need to have been drawn in exactly the same position, because it's not about literally laying them on top of each other. It's just about showing you that this end of this is going to be joining onto this end of this. Now we are going to pin the end of seam 4 that's got the asterisks on it. And so what we'll do first is we'll lay these pins at the end of the ear gap on top of each other, remove one, put this pin through the 2 layers, and now put a pin through the piece of fabric where you've got your asterisks here, the asterisks below. So let's just line that up so the corners are together, put a pin in, and then put pins between those 2 points. For this you'll be better off working with this seam upwards, because when you go to sew you don't want this piece of seam getting caught in your feed dogs and messing up your line of stitching. So I'm just going to move the fabric around a bit here, line it all up nicely, and then put the rest of the pins in. Here it is with all the pins in, and just to clarify, when you're looking at the hat back, it's this bit that we're doing, the dashed line here that runs from the asterisks up to the end of that ear gap. So we're not sewing into the ear gap, purely from the asterisk piece up to the end of the ear gap. And again, we're going to use that 1 centimetre or 6/8 of an inch seam allowance. I am just going to put my fabric under my sewing machine foot, and I will be starting my thread just in front of where that pin at the end of the ear gap is, so that I can do my reverse stitches to start with. So put your needle down. Remember, you must have still got this at the 1 centimetre 6/8 seam allowance needle position. So a couple of reverse stitches, and now let's sew all the way down to the end here, and then we'll do a couple of reverse stitches to finish. Make sure, especially if you've got a bulky fabric, that this is all laying nice and flat, so you don't have a messy point in your stitches. Put the needle down, let's do some reverse stitches. So that's one end of seam 4 completed. I'm just going to take my pins out, and I'm not trimming off the seam allowance or anything here, leaving it all exactly as is. And now I'm going to pin and sew the other end of seam 4. My seam 4 is now entirely sewn, so it's the sewn element and then the ear gap, the sewn piece through the middle and the ear gap, and then the sewn piece at the end. The next task is to take the hat across to your ironing board and to hold the seams open like so and press them flat with your iron. When you get to the ear gaps, make sure that the stitching here, your guide stitching, is right on the edge of that fold, so you've got a really nice neat line. Okay, here's how I am effectively ironing seam 4 flat. So I've ironed this end and the other end, and I have ironed the middle, and then I've just turned it over and I have folded it so that that seam there is right along the top of the fold, and I've put some pins just to hold it in position, so now I can, when I iron it, I know that it's correct there. And then I'll do the same for the other pieces of ear gap too. Not all fabric glues are created equal, so this one's good because it's got the little nozzle on the end. I can just give it a little squeeze and put it against that seam, and then I'm going to push it flat and hold it in position with a pin. And when I get to the ear gaps here, when I've put my line of glue along, I am going to hold that one flat using a sewing clip. There we are, and I'm going to go all the way along seam 4 like that, gluing, pinning and clipping as necessary. You could just hold it with pins and then sew, but I'm finding that if I've put some glue, then it stops it from moving when it goes under the sewing machine foot and is sewn flat later on. Once the glue has dried, take out the pins and take off the clips. Then turn your hat through so that the right side of fabric is facing outwards. Now we're going to take our hat across to our sewing machine. We're going to reset our needle so it's back to the 5mm or 1/4 inch seam allowance, and we are going to sew a line of top stitching all the way along this side of that seam 4 and then all the way along this side of seam 4. So let's start at the beginning and have your sewing machine set up so that the edge of your sewing machine foot here is on seam 4 there. Just pop the needle down. So my needle is back in the 5mm or 1/4 inch position, and I'm just going to do my reverse stitches to start. And now I'm going to sew all the way along, keeping that correct distance from this central seam. Because we have used a larger seam allowance when we have done the ear gaps earlier and we've glued them, this fabric should be caught in that seam. And here is that first line of top stitching sewn, and if I turn the hat over, hopefully you can see that the stitches have caught that edge that we had folded over and glued. So that's all now secure, and now I am going to sew a second line of top stitching on this side of seam 4, so it will do exactly the same function as the first one, and because I've got this contrast stitching I think it looks quite smart. I've just sewn the second line of top stitching, so now you can see that they're both there, they're nice and neat, and when I turn it over you can see that the fabric is caught within those lines of stitching, so it's all nice and secure. Now we're going to sew the darts, so let's turn the hat back through so the wrong side of fabric is outwards again, and we've got each of these darts here, same process for each one. Let's fold the fabric so the right sides of fabric are together, and just move it a little so that the points are next to each other like so, and put a pin in here and a pin towards the top as well to hold it. Now bring that first dart across to your sewing machine, pop it under the foot, put the foot down so your edge of your foot is on the raw edge of your fabric, and you're going to start a couple of millimeters in from the end of the fabric there. Pop your needle down, some reverse stitches to start, and now we're going to sew forwards until we're going to keep this foot on the raw edge of fabric until we've got to the end, and then we'll just basically continue the line up so it comes off the folded fabric. I'll show you now. So now my needle's in line with the end of that dart, and I'm just going to sew off the end and then a few reverse stitches to secure. There we are, I'm back. And now if I just take it out from under the foot, cut that thread, and I'll show you, you see that line? So it's a nice neat line from the edge up to here. So my line of stitches has come off and I've done those reverse stitches to secure it, and now I'm going to do exactly the same process for all the other darts. So here's my first dart. You can see that it's in a straight line. Fabric's curved, it doesn't look completely straight, but there we are. Let's snip off these threads and fold the next dart. So exactly the same process. Fold it so the right edges of fabric, the right sides of fabric are together. Pop a pin down the bottom and put a pin towards the top. And I will take it to my sewing machine and I'm going to sew from here up to here, a couple of reverse stitches at the beginning and end of the seam. Here is my flat cap now that all the darts have been sewn, and what I'm going to do next is I'm going to take it across to my iron and I am going to press each of the darts open. So all the way along, open each one up and then press them so they look nice and neat if anyone ever looks at the inside of the flat cap. Now we are going to construct the band. So what you want to do is put the two short ends together like so and then pin them. I'm going to take this across to the sewing machine and sew from here to here with a 1 centimetre or 6/8 of an inch seam allowance. Here is the band now that I've sewn that seam, so it is 1 centimetre or 6/8 of an inch away from the edge, and I'm just going to take the pins out and take it across to my ironing board and iron it so that this seam is opened up and flat. So I'm just going to press the band from that direction and from that direction with a bit of steam to make it nice and bendable. And just open it up like so, and then give it a good press like that. The next step is to fold your band so the wrong side of fabric is inside, the right side of fabric faces outwards like so, and you're folding it so that the raw edges are together. So it's a little fiddly to try and do whilst there's a camera between my eyes and the fabric. There we are. And I'm just going to keep going all the way around. I'm using plenty of steam, so I've got a nice sharp fold so that it looks smart. Returning to my hat with all these darts ironed open, I'm going to turn it through so the right side of the fabric is inside. Make sure that the brim is tucked inside, so basically it'll look like a bowl shape. And then I'm going to get my band and start to pin it inside. Across the back of your hat you've got the 5 darts, so you've got thicker fabric where these are ironed open, so do not pin the seam of your band directly on to one of the dart seams. Instead, place it in between 2 of them and pop a pin in to hold it. And then we're going to pin this band all the way around the hat, so it's this raw open edge. Hold it closed with your fingers and just pop the pins in. So edge of band meets up with edge of hat. Whoops, lost my pin, all the way around. As you get round to where the brim is, it is going to be a lot thicker. Just keep everything still nicely lined up and continue pinning until it's pinned in all the way around. So I'm sewing the band onto the hat and my presser foot is running along my edge of my fabric and my needle is rising and falling 5 millimeters or 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of that fabric, and I'm going to sew all the way around and make sure when I get to the end of my stitching that my line of stitching definitely overlaps, so that there isn't a gap. So here is the inside of my hat and I finished sewing the seam. You can see there it is on the outside as well. So let's just take the pins out. Now I'm going to turn my hat through So the right side of fabric is facing outwards, and then I'm going to pull the band down. So do this all the way around. There we go. And then I'm going to take the hat across to my ironing board and I'm going to press it to open this seam up as much as possible. So just press downwards all the way around, because that means then in a bit when we turn the band up inside the hat, you won't have got sort of a long wobbly line of fabric showing. It will be a nice neat crisp edge. So once it's all open, let's iron. So I'm just puffing some steam and then pushing this seam all the way along with my iron. Here is that seam all nicely ironed open. So now I'm going to turn the hat and tuck the band up inside and pop pins to hold it, like so. You want to check before you start stitching that the band is nicely tucked inside and that you haven't got an uneven amount of band showing below the level of the main fabric of your hat. So I'll carry on pinning round this way, but I'm not going to pin the band up inside the brim area. So when I stitch this band, this final seam of the band inside the hat, I am going to stitch from this junction here and all the way around to this junction here on the opposite side. If you try and stitch the band inside the brim, the seams aren't all going to lie nice and flat. So only think about that pinning, ready for that stitching on the bit that's not by the hat brim. Okay. Just to show you before I go across to my sewing machine, I have popped pins in on these two top stitch lines. So as I sew, I'm going to put my needle in here so it falls in this line, stitch back to this line and then stitch around from there, because I really want that line of stitching, all these lines of stitching, to be super neat and super intentional so that they'll look smart when my hat is completed. So I've put my needle in on the line of top stitching that is furthest from the brim. I'm going to do my reverse stitching till I get to the line of top stitching nearest the brim, then I'm going to sew forwards. Just take that pin out and do a couple more, I think. And there we are, and now sew all the way around. Keep this super neat, keep it a lovely equal distance away from the edge, because this is your finishing seam and it will just add to the overall look of your hat. And here is my seam fully sewn. So as I came round to the end of the hat, I stopped at this line of top stitching and I reversed to this line of top stitching. So I'm just going to snip my threads, and then before we put our hat on our bear, we just need to give it a little press with our irons to make sure it's going to sit really nicely on our bear's head. Here we are at the ironing board, and when I look at this seam here, so this is the one between the front of the hat and the rise, it's not completely even, so I'm just going to run my paintbrush around the inside. It was sewn evenly, but it's not sitting perfectly evenly, and yes, that's now rounded out, so I'm just going to press that. Now that I've got that seam nicely rounded out, I'm just going to press the top of the hat down onto the brim. There we are, and just pop round again with my iron. just so that it stays nicely together on your bear. And there we are, fully sewn, ready to be popped onto a bear. Now the flat cap pattern is fully sewn. Here it is on Betsy Bear, and she's just going round, and you'll be able to see the side view in a mo. There we go, and now I'll show it to you on Charlie Bear. And here's the flat cap again, this time made up in a slightly paler denim, and this time it's on Charlie Bear. Here are Betsy Bear and Charlie Bear wearing their flat caps. I really hope you found this video useful. If you did, please could you leave a thumbs up or add a comment below, and if you subscribe to my channel, you'll get notifications whenever I release new tutorial videos. Thank you for watching.